Read this headline. The IRS is drafting plans to cut as much as half of its 90,000 person workforce. We're seeing a lot of changes when it comes to taxes. For example, this comes after Trump's new proposal to slash taxes across the board. And these changes to the IRS are very different than what we saw before because under the Biden administration, Biden was working to increase the number of IRS employees by potentially tens of thousands. As an attorney, who's not your attorney, I can tell you that our tax code is complicated because, well, I keep a copy of the federal income tax code in my office and it is more than 2,000 pages long with very, very small font. And now with the shakeup with the IRS and the changes in our tax code, things are going to change even more. Let me show you what I mean. We have to start by understanding how taxes work. The government has one source of income. It's tax dollars from taxpayers. So here are you, the taxpayers, and you are paying taxes into the United States government. I'll explain how you're paying taxes in just a minute, but you pay money into the United States government in the form of tax, and then the government's going to go out and they're going to spend money. Where are they spending money? Well, Social Security, Medicare, National Defense, interest payments, health costs, income security, veterans benefits, education. The problem that the government is facing with this model right here is that the government does not believe in the whole act your wage thing because the government spends a whole lot more money than what they generate from taxes. So they're spending a whole lot more here. In 2024, the United States government collected about $4.9 trillion in tax revenue from taxpayers, but then they went out and spent about $6.75 trillion in tax revenue, which means they spent almost $2 trillion more than what they generated, and this additional deficit spending was financed through more debt. This is where we can start to see a problem. Problem number one is right here, that there are a lot of different types of taxes and it can be kind of complicated. And problem number two is we're spending a whole lot more than what we're generating from taxes. And so this is where now we're starting to see a lot of changes happen. These are the two things that Trump is trying to address. Let me show you what it means. Now again, my goal with these videos is not to discuss the political agenda of the tax proposals. I want you to understand what's happening from a financial perspective, that way you know what's going on, that way you can take better care of yourself, your family, and your community, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter if you believe in Democrat or Republican, money is still green and you need that money to take care of your family. So now that we've laid the foundation, let's go a little bit deeper to understand the two concerns. Number one, paying too much money in taxes, and number two, the government spending too much money, starting with paying too much money in taxes. If you're subscribed to my channel, you might have heard me talk about this before, but there are a lot of different categories of taxes. I broke it up into 10 different buckets. Number one is you pay an income tax. If you go to work, you get paid. That W-2 income that you generate, well, you have a tax on that. On top of that, you also have to worry about a payroll tax. This is your FICA taxes, your Social Security and Medicare taxes. This is on top of your income tax, and you as the employee have to worry about this payroll tax, and your employer also have to pay the same payroll tax. If you're self-employed and you pay yourself a salary, well, now you have to pay this twice. You as the employer and as the employee, you pay double that payroll tax. So every employee has to pay this payroll tax, and then the employer paying the employee also have to pay the payroll tax. Capital gains taxes are when you buy an investment and you sell it for profit. That's your capital gains tax. Corporate taxes are when a corporation makes a profit. That corporation has to pay a corporate tax. Sales taxes, when you go to the store and you buy something, you got to pay a sales tax. 6, property tax, you buy a house. Every year you have to pay a property tax. Number 7, estate tax, also known as a death tax. If you die with a lot of assets, millions and millions of dollars, and you pass this down to your kids or to other people, well, there's an estate tax on that. Number 8 are sin taxes. If the government wants to discourage something or wants to tax something a lot, then they can use the sin tax. For example, cigarette taxes. Number 9 are tariffs. We've been hearing a lot about this lately. Tariffs are now taxing imported goods from foreign countries. And then number 10, I lumped everything else into other. This can be things like hotel taxes or airport taxes, toll taxes, all the other taxes kind of lumped into one thing here. So there are a lot of different types of taxes. And this is where we're starting to see changes. Number one, we've seen a big proposal to cut down the income tax in many different ways. Number one, Trump has talked about extending the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and he's talked about many different ways to reform the income tax bill. We'll see what actually ends up getting approved and signed by the president. We'll be keeping you posted here and on Market Briefs, which is my free financial newsletter, but we'll see what ends up happening with that. In addition, we've been seeing a lot of changes with tariff taxes, where there's been new tariff taxes imposed, some get paused, some new ones get created. The whole idea being, from a revenue perspective, not from a policy perspective, another way to collect income for the United States government as those goods come into the country. Are there concerns with this? Absolutely. Could it make the inflation problem worse? Yes. Could it hurt businesses? Sure. Could it hurt consumers? Sure. But we're not focusing on all of that right now. I just want you to understand the tax side of things in this video. But then we have the second layer of concern here, which is of course the government spending, because we know that the government has been running this large deficit, meaning the government is spending way more money than what they're generating in taxes. And this is a problem because if the government keeps borrowing more and more money, the money has to come from somewhere. And the United States government can borrow this money from investors, they can borrow this money from China and Japan and other foreign countries. But the largest lender to the United States government is none other than the Federal Reserve Bank, who's the central bank here in the United States. Now, although they're called the Federal Reserve Bank, they're actually not federal. They're not a part of the United States government. They're not a reserve because they're not sitting on any cash reserves, and they're not a bank because you and I can't go there to deposit money, but they have the ability to print money and lend it to the United States government, which is nice because when the government has more money to spend, they can hire more people, they can build more bridges, they can pay more teachers, they can do a whole bunch of things, which is good for the economy, especially in the short term. But there's a consequence to that, because if the government can just print this unlimited amounts of money, why are we paying taxes in the first place? Why do we have all these taxes if the government can just print and borrow this money? Well, the reason why is because there's a consequence to all that money printing. There's a consequence to all the deficit spending, and the consequence is, of course, inflation. Inflation hurts the average person, but it benefits investors. That's why if we take a look at the last 5 years, we have seen median incomes go up by around 20%. We've seen inflation at around 23%. That's the reported numbers. Many people have seen inflation much higher than that. But the reported inflation number is 23%, which is higher than the median income growth, while the stock market has gone up by around 80%. Inflation disproportionately benefits the investor while the average person gets hurt. And this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that started in 2020. This has been going on for decades. Decade after decade after decade, we've been seeing the same thing. Even the Federal Reserve Bank says that we don't want 0% inflation. They want 2% inflation. 2% inflation is low enough that the average person doesn't notice it day to day, but it continues to eat away at the value of your savings. It continues to eat away at the value of your salary, which makes the average person poorer, it makes the middle class smaller, and the people that understand this get wealthier and wealthier because they get to keep winning in this system. But this is where I want to talk about what's going on here right now. Some people hate it, some people love it. I really don't care. I want you to understand what's going on. The first thing is the Trump administration in this new tax proposal. It has a lot of tax cuts, but also spending cuts as a way to reduce this. Now, there's also a lot of changes being done by DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, to reduce some of the spending and waste that's being done by the government. Some of the ways that DOGE is doing this is by reducing government funding. Other ways that DOGE is doing this is by laying people off and cutting departments. The whole idea being, let's reduce some of this government spending while also reducing some of these taxes, based off of the numbers that I'm seeing online. Again, this is just proposals, these are just numbers, it's not for sure. The goal looks like it is to cut taxes by around $4.5 trillion, not over 1 year, but over a number of years, while also reducing the spending budget by around $2 trillion. And this now ties into the whole purpose of this video, which is laying off a big chunk of the IRS workforce. What does that do in this situation? Well, it doesn't really change the tax code. I mean, you can have the same tax code with less employees running it, but the whole idea here is it is reducing the amount of government spend. But this is the part that gets confusing because we don't know what the impact of this is going to be. I don't know, as a person outside of the government, how many employees the IRS needs. I don't know if they need 90,000, 500,000, or 20. I have no idea. And this is where it looks like what the Trump administration is trying to do is they want to see how they can get the same IRS doing whatever they need to do with half the cost. So what does this laying off of IRS employees mean for your taxes? Well, right now, nothing. However, if you are waiting on an IRS refund, I have read some reports online that because of the timing of these layoffs or potential layoffs, it could increase the amount of time you potentially need, not for sure, but potentially need to get that IRS refund. We don't know for sure, but this is what some people are saying. According to the IRS website, if you are waiting on a refund, it should take about 21 calendar days to get that processed. If this takes longer, we'll ultimately see how long that takes. But there is one thing that I do want to mention about tax refunds, which is a little bit of a tangent from this video, which is if you are waiting on a refund, this is not a bonus check. This is money that you overgave the government. This is a loan that you gave to the government at a 0% interest rate. The reason why I'm saying this is because there's a lot of false emotions around tax refunds. Where people get excited when they get a big tax refund. People get excited about the idea of tax refunds. But what a tax refund is, it means you gave the government too much money in taxes in the first place. And then, because you gave the government so much money, they hold on to that money, they spend that money, and then they get that money back to you months later without paying you any interest. So, if you are getting a tax refund, that means you did something wrong. It means you paid the government too much money in taxes to begin with. And this is where understanding how some of this tax stuff works can be very beneficial, and I get it. You know, if you're working a job, paying thousands of dollars for an accountant just is not feasible. But this is where there are a lot of free softwares out there. There are a lot of tools that you can use that are inexpensive that you can look at to potentially help you make sure you're optimizing how much money you're paying in taxes, because one of the largest costs for Americans is, of course, taxes. There are many different types of taxes out there, and as somebody who has spent a lot of time studying the tax law, what I can tell you is that our tax code taxes income differently, and our tax code incentivizes people to become investors, or some people like to say it punishes you for being an employee. What I mean by that is if you earn your money as an employee versus earn your money as an investor, the investor can make the same amount of money as the employee but pay less money in taxes legally. When you earn your money from investments, you get to qualify for lower tax rates or higher tax breaks. When you earn your money as an employee, you are getting what's called ordinary income or earned income. It's the same thing. But what that means is you are paying the highest tax rates and you get the lowest tax breaks. This is why it's so important for you to understand this, because we all know that taxes are very expensive. I don't care who you are. Taxes are expensive. And if you can understand this, you can use the tax code to your advantage, because what every single wealthy person understands is that the tax code is a rule book. Most people want to argue about it. Most people want to complain about it. I want you to understand the game. I want you to understand how it works. That way you can take better care of yourself, your family, and your community. But you can't do that unless you understand the rules of the game. President Trump is now considering getting rid of the income tax. Take a listen.
As I said in my speech last week, instead of taxing our citizens to enrich foreign nations, we should be tariffing and taxing foreign nations to enrich our citizens.
The Fair Tax Act of 2025 was a bill proposed which would effectively abolish the IRS.